Hi there, welcome to the recording of Verse for the Earth, a climate poetry workshop. My name is Serena Amder, and I'm the cultural curator here at the Michigan Climate Action Network, which means that I lead all of our art and culture programming, and my role is to really help our members and network leverage art and culture and creative voices in order to inspire and connect and mobilize Michiganders to more climate action, help foster a deeper emotional resilience so that we're better equipped to take on the climate crisis that we're facing, as well as help push for those deep cultural transformations that we know we need to have in order to work towards a more just and sustainable future for all of us. So, this poetry workshop fits right into all of that, trying to introduce folks to another form of or another art medium where they can try to process their own experience living through the climate crisis and share that with us, as well as getting to experience some of that art that others have created in a communal space. So, this workshop is led today by Eileen Buchestein, who is an environmental educator and communicator who specializes in connecting people to their place and region. During this workshop, she shares a presentation on navigating climate feelings with a big emphasis on the importance of an active hope. And I will link that presentation for you so that you can follow along a little bit more easily. Throughout the presentation, there's also a couple of poems that she shares, as well as some time for our participants to take a moment to try writing something of their own, reflect, and if they want to, share with the group. We decided to pause recording during all of those portions just to make it a little bit easier for folks to share what's on their mind and share their feelings and not be worried about that recording living somewhere forever. So that means that this recording is a little bit cut up, and there might be some moments that goes from one section and just puts you right into the next one. Please feel free to pause as you go. After there's a poem that's read, take your own time to write and respond to it as much as you'd like before continuing on with the workshop. Two of those poems that are shared were recordings, so that's also not included in this video itself, but I will have links so that you can go enjoy those videos and recordings in the places where those actually live rather than them being in this recording itself. So without further ado, here is the rest of the workshop. Hope you enjoy.
I'm gonna start us off with this won't surprise you, a poem by one of my favorite authors, Mary Oliver. So I'm gonna read this one aloud to you, and then we'll jump into our first sort of presentation section. And I will just mention it's difficult for me to see the chat while I'm presenting, so I'll check in with the chat at each of our little pause sections. So just so you know what to expect there. So this one that I want to start out with today is called Winter Hours. In the winter I am writing about, there was much darkness, a darkness of nature, darkness of event, darkness of the spirit, the sprawling darkness of not knowing. We speak of the light of reason. I would speak here of the darkness of the world and the light of, but I don't know what to call it. It may be hope, maybe faith, but not a shaped faith, only say a gesture or a continuum of gestures. But probably it is closer to hope. That is more active and far messier than faith must be. Faith, as I imagine it, is tensile and cool and has no need of words. Hope, I know, is a fighter and a screamer. I stumbled across this Mary Oliver. I know almost every Mary Oliver poem, and I hadn't seen this one in a long time, and I stumbled across it while I was working on a similar presentation for educators a couple of months ago, and it struck me how closely it mirrors, kind of the ways I'm feeling about the world right now. There's just so much. It was winter, physical winter at the time that I was reading this, but also, just the winter of and the darkness of things that feel like they're happening. And so, one of the themes that's going to run throughout today is this idea of hope and what does it look like to hope? Because there are some understandings of hope that are weak understandings of hope that are not active understandings of hope. And so we're gonna talk a little bit about active hope and what I will talk a little bit more about calling transformative hope throughout this presentation. So it's not just processing our climate emotions, but also how do we take them and turn them into something that leads us towards climate action. So I'll begin with talking a little bit about this essay that a friend of mine shared with me from, oh boy, this was a while ago, 2006, I think, that this came out in Orion magazine. And it's not poetry. Sorry, I'm starting out by talking about a writing form that's not poetry, but this was an essay in Orion magazine. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a teacher about how I was doing this presentation about hope, and he said, "Oh, I read this really interesting article about how hope is like useless in Orion magazine." And I was like, "Oh, cool, send me the link. I'll read it." And this was a pretty widely read essay at the time by a writer named Derek Jensen, in which he argues for us to ditch the idea of hope, basically. I'll pull a couple of his quotes up. He talked about hope as a longing for a future condition over which you have no agency. It means you are essentially powerless. And he said, when you give up on hope, you turn away from fear. Uh, and this is a really, I'm seeing this a little bit less now, but for a long time, this was a really popular view of hope when it comes to climate action. This idea that hope is just sort of like, oh, we'll work it out. We've worked it out before. It'll be fine. And I want to talk a little bit throughout about how we respond to this idea of what hope is or isn't. And there's some really wonderful, beautiful poetry about what it is, what hope actually means that we'll be talking about. So just to kind of give you a sense of where I'm going where I'm going with some of my uh, poem selections today, you'll see that we'll kind of come back and we'll talk about this a little bit more. I will at some point and maybe in one of the breaks, drop a link to this article in the chat for you. It's really interesting to read. And I will teaser and let you know that towards the end of the article, I think he and I come to like an agreement on what hope means. But it was really interesting to me to read that and to think, oh, this is a cool framing for what I'm going to be talking about with folks here. So with that in mind, what does it mean? Maybe we don't have hope. Before we kind of get started and dive into our first sort of like presentation section, I want to take a moment to sort of like not necessarily ground, but kind of level set here. Give yourself maybe 30, 60 seconds. Hopefully you've got something you can write with nearby. If not, feel free to run and grab something. But when you think about climate change, I want you to sort of gut reaction, first couple of things that come up for you. It could be a word, it could be a phrase, it could be a color, it could be an image. Jot down, take 30 seconds, jot down what is it that comes up for you when you think climate change. So we're going to jump into our first. We have 4 sort of big sections that have a little bit of presentation, and I will say a lot of this content in these presentations is not going to be new to you if you are following the climate crisis, which I'm sure you all are. But what I want to do for you is sort of package this and show you how going through and thinking about this type of material might lead you to process it in a different type of way. So we're going to move into, thinking about this essay that we started out with by Derek Jensen, this idea that like hope is worthless. We don't want to hope anything. What does he get right in that essay? And the thing that he gets right in that essay is the idea that the climate crisis is real, it's costly, and we should be alarmed by it. It is incredibly alarming what is happening here. So the science is clear when we look at the last 175 years of observed data and we model what should have happened with natural impacts only versus natural and human impacts. It's clear that the human impacts are playing a role in increasing our global temperatures dramatically. And the impact of climate change is not just in temperature. It's in these patterns, these large scale patterns, which we've seen have devastating impacts, even just here in Michigan, and even just quite recently with things like our incredible flooding we had over the last few weeks. So in the last decade, our state has experienced massive flooding. We've had dam failures, we've had high water levels, we've had low water levels, we've had major erosion, we've had crop failures from erratic spring temperatures. We've had these fluctuating polar vortexes. We've got increases in disease-carrying insects like ticks. We've got toxic algal blooms. We've got businesses that are struggling because they rely on seasonal consistency, and we don't have that consistency. And we felt these changes everywhere. Like I mentioned, we just had incredible flooding on a scale not seen. Our water resource division director at Eagle said that this scale and intensity of flooding hasn't been seen for 40 plus years across the state of Michigan. So um, we're feeling it, and rain especially. Before I came to the state, I worked on stormwater water quality issues, and one of the big issues that we see here in Michigan is rain. So compared to 1900, we're almost 3 degrees warmer, but even bigger, we get about 5 more inches of rain per year. And our infrastructure is not really well structured to manage the volume of rain that we're getting here in the state. Outside of Michigan, extreme weather impacts are happening as well. In 2025 alone, we had 23 different billion-dollar weather and climate reactions. And these are real, these are costly. These impacts are increasing over time across not just the United States, but the entire world. As I mentioned, I work with education, and a lot of time that I spend is with teachers and with schools. And these costs that we're feeling in climate change are felt beyond simply the dollar cost. So we feel this in schools. We feel this with our youngest and most vulnerable members of our community in places like schools that should be safe for them. So this is a map published by an organization called Undaunted K-12. It shows places in the United States where schools have experienced either a disruption or a closure because of extreme weather. So this is just a screenshot, but when you zoom in on the map, it'll tell you also how many students were affected by that, either disruption or closure for each instance. And the different colors represent different effects. So if your screen is small and you can't see very well, the blue is extreme cold, the red is extreme heat, the green is flooding, the gray is hurricanes, the yellow is severe weather, and the orange is wildfires. And you can see these are spread across the entire country. And while I will mention that while there are large areas where you don't see a lot of data on the map, remember, these dots are clustered in areas where the vast majority of our population lives. So millions and millions of youth across the state, across the country have had direct impacts on their school day as a result of extreme weather, and many of these extreme weather events are exacerbated by climate change. And this is just in the United States alone, not to mention global impact. The costs of these losses add up in ways that include our health. So physical changes in climate cause threats to health in things like food and water insecurity or extreme weather events, communicable disease spread, and more. And these can have serious outcomes on our health: injury, fatalities, illness, violence. We see domestic violence spike when we have these heat waves. These outcomes are often accompanied by significant mental health impacts, and those can be direct. There's people experiencing PTSD or trauma from experiencing an extreme weather event like a hurricane. But we also see some really interesting research around indirect effects on health from climate change. So there's this really, it's a really sad word, but I think the word is really beautiful. It's solastalgia. And it is the unique mental anguish caused by negative environmental changes to your home. So this idea of, as climate change changes the nature of a place, the environmental nature, uh, the place that you remember is no longer really in existence. It's not like that anymore. When I was in college, I went out to the Pacific Northwest. I took some classes for a few weeks out there, and we went hiking in the Cascades, and it was just like green and wildflowers and beautiful. And I went back, 5 or 6 years ago. Oh man, it might be longer now, time. But I went back, and it was a particularly to visit as an adult, and it was a particularly bad fire and drought season. And I hiked one of those same trails that I just remembered being gorgeous and full of wildflowers and life. And it was just brown. It was dry. It was it was unrecognizable. The whole time I was on that trail, I was like, I'm not sure if this is the same place. And I think about that feeling of sort of like despair, like, oh, I had this memory and that memory is gone. That is the feeling of solastalgia. Yes, Derek in the chat has written it out for you. And yes, frontline communities, Indigenous communities in particular, feel this because of that deep connection to the land and to the place. So yes, we are feeling this deeply. These are things that we feel, we see, we should be affected by that. We should be affected by these changes. So how do we respond to all of this? We're going to be talking about hope today, eventually, in a few minutes, which requires us to really be able to manage our own feelings of fear and anxiety. And one of the ways we can address that distress is by expressing and speaking to our emotions through poetry. So, that essay I mentioned at the beginning, Jensen tells us that our anxiety is good and that it encourages us to act. And this is a very, very common uh, response to say, we want this, all this bad stuff should encourage us to act. And in some ways, yes, that is absolutely true. And that's when I think of when I hear this poem that I will play for you. The darkness of this information can be a bell tower for us, a call for us to change. And one of the ways we can grapple with the challenges of feeling overwhelmed by climate change is to remind ourselves of that power that we have to turn those challenges into a change. So this is one that I'm going to play from you. There was a really beautiful series. Boy, it was probably, I don't know, it was a long time ago now on the On Being podcast, and they always play a lot of poetry there. Krista Tippett loves poetry. And they had a bunch of poems that were read and recorded with these beautiful sort of illustrations alongside of them. So this is one of those. This one will play for you. And while it plays, I want you to think of a couple of things, because after it plays, I'm going to give you a couple of moments to respond and think about, the information that has been discussed here. So uh, while you're listening, first of all, write down whatever comes to mind. But a couple of ideas, prompts, if you need something, is what are you feeling as you're listening to this poem? What are you feeling? What are you noticing as you're listening to the poem? Is there about the poem or about your own feelings? And then what does this remind you of? What does this call to mind for you when you hear it? For me, it called to mind, when I read this bell tower poem, it called to mind this idea of, bringing us to action. But what does it bring to mind for you? I'm going to play the poem. Um, it's short. It's about a minute and a half that you'll hear. So let's see. Let's not get trapped in this dark place, which looks like most of you are already not. So I'm excited about that. So yes, this all realistically brings about a lot of anxiety. It is no surprise that people are feeling anxiety about this. The near daily bad news. Whoops, I went back too quick. The most recent IPCC report, just it's terrifying. And our young people, I'm an educator, and so I'm bringing these young people up to the forefront again because they are especially feeling this anxiety. So I'm going to throw a couple of like reports in your face here for you to digest here. A study published in the Lancet Planetary Health in December of 2021 reported the results of a survey of 10,000 children from 10 countries around the world, focusing on climate anxiety and their beliefs about government responses to climate change. And the results are really upsetting. 75% of these young people said the future is frightening. 83% said they felt like people have failed to take care of the planet. Um, and you can see in this graphic here, all countries are at the top. The USA is the one at the bottom. And globally, 59% are either very or extremely worried about climate change. So that's these pink, the sort of red and salmon color. If you add these two together, 59% of children are very or extremely worried. If you add in this moderately, that bumps up to 84%. And the really heartbreaking statistic on this for me is this 45% of children saying that their concern has a negative impact on their daily life and functioning. That's the level of concern that they're dealing with. A similar study was done in 2024, also published in the Lancet, looking at the way that young people a little bit older, ages 16 to 24, feel about climate change in the United States. So this graph has all of the different US states on here, and it's a little busy, but what I want you to know is that the 50 US states are here on the y-axis, and the two lightest colors on the left side represent not at all or a little worried about climate change and its impact on the planet, whereas those three darker colors on the right side are that moderately, very, or extremely worried about climate change and its impacts on people on the planet. So these numbers of not at all or a little are pretty small. The vast majority of young people, even in the United States, are moderately, very, or extremely worried about climate change and its impacts on people and the planet. And I probably don't need to tell you this, but they are also feeling not good about our government's responses to climate change. And this is in 2021, so that this data is from. So I would imagine these numbers have only become more extreme probably in the last 5 years. So they are feeling extremely betrayed by the way that our governments are responding, not just in the United States, but globally. Young people feel like their countries aren't doing enough. And it's not just young people, it is all of us. So we are all feeling anxious about climate change. So this is the Yale program on climate change communication, results from their, this is actually updated for their 2025 data, not their 2022. So 2 in 3 Americans, about 65%, say they are at least somewhat worried about climate change. And this is a 10% increase over the past 10 years. 3 in 10 Americans are very worried, which is a 2 to 3 times increase in the past, in the past 10 years. So we're dealing with children, we're dealing as adults with these intense feelings that we need to manage. And those of us who are educators or work with young people, it's really important for us to manage our own feelings as we go and work with youth so that we're not intensifying and making their own feelings worse. So we're not quite to the hope part yet. Sorry. I know you thought maybe we were going to get into hope in this section, but we're still in the sad part. And I'm going to read aloud to you for our next poem, a poem that a friend of mine sent me a few years ago. So it was right in the thick of the COVID pandemic. It was pretty new. It was right in that, April, May time period of 2020 when we were just really not seeing anybody. We were all in our homes. We didn't know what was going on. And a lot of people had a lot of different things going on. So it was a difficult time in life. This was not even climate related for me. I just had some stuff going on with my family. And a friend of mine sent me this poem, and it was, she had put it on a laminated bookmark that she sent me. And as I was preparing for this presentation, I was going through all my poetry books, trying to see if I wanted anything new to add. And I ran across that bookmark and I was like, this poem is perfect for the presentation. So I'm going to read aloud to you next, and keep those same prompts and thoughts in mind because we'll have a little bit of response time. Reading aloud a poem called The Trough by Judy Brown. There is a trough in the waves, a low spot where horizon disappears and only sky and water are our company. And there we lose our way unless we rest, knowing that the wave will bring us to its crest again. There we may drown if we let fear hold us in its grip and shake us side to side and leave us flailing, torn, disoriented. But if we rest there in the trough, in silence, being in the low part of the wave, keeping our energy and noticing the shape of things, the flow, then time alone will bring us to another place where we can see horizon, see land again, regain our sense of where we are and where we need to swim. So we're going to take another few minutes to reflect on this, maybe a different way that we look at that difficult place. So in our last reflection, we were kind of looking at this idea of the darkness and the intensity being a bell tower, being a call to action. I want to take a moment now for us to think about the idea of the darkness and the stress and the intensity being also a call for us to rest and to care for ourselves. And for me, I wanted to talk about this one a little bit because I mentioned I've worked with the MyCan folks quite a bit over the last few years. And one thing I really admire about the MyCan staff is the very intentional way that they carve out time for themselves to rest and rejuvenate, knowing how necessary that is as an activist. So I want to think about that a little bit in our next reflection period here. So once again, I'm gonna set my timer for 3 minutes. If you want to go back and keep working on something you were working on in the last section, go for it. If you want to reflect on this idea, go ahead. But I want you to take some time to sort of sit with what you're feeling and start to put something down on paper. Again, whether it's poetry, prose, random disconnected words, that's usually what I end up writing down in this type of situation. Maybe it's a picture. Again, maybe it's just a quiet moment of reflection for you. And feel free to drop things in the chat as we go or as we're done, and I'll give us just a couple minutes to respond here. Everybody puts, I love it when everybody puts the red and the yellow and the orange, whatever, as the colors in the chat, because that's what comes up for me too. When I think about the color idea. So with what we've talked about with climate anxiety and the causes, like what about hope? I thought we were going to talk about hope. I put that quote back up there from that essay, Hope is a Longing for Future Condition Over Which You Have No Agency. And, if you think of hope the way this lady holding the sign does, as like, oh, it's going to be fine, it's going to work out, well, everything burns behind you, then yeah, that's true. And in some cases, yes, facing that reality of the crisis, how bad it is important, and it can cause us to want to act. It's not productive to just stick your head in the sand. But I want to spend a little bit of time now together rethinking the meaning of hope, because in the years, I mentioned that essay was written in 2006, the one that I mentioned earlier. In the years since that was published, there's been a lot of discussion and rethinking of what it means to hope. So I want to talk about a little bit where that sort of old perspective of hope is no longer accurate, and why these new ideas of hope, especially what I'm calling transformative hope, are so powerful. So that essay from Jensen, he argues basically that facing our doom is the only thing that will allow us to overcome it, which in some cases is true, but we have learned so much in the last decade about the intensity of climate anxiety and the way that affects us, especially young people. And it can be really simple to focus only on the science and how bad everything is, and the danger and the misinformation and the consequences. And it's important to know that stuff and to understand where we stand before trying to fix things. But too much focus on the doom can have the opposite effect, so that negative news constantly can leave us feeling helpless, demotivated, disempowering. There is clearly research out there looking at the way that, especially with young people in education, the way that we communicate this message, the overly doom message leaves them feeling less likely to act than if there was a little bit more support there. So with something as difficult and as urgent as climate change, the last thing we want to do is make people feel like giving up. Some of the research that's out there suggests that climate doom is just as problematic as climate denial in terms of how effective it is at creating inaction. So how are we going to combat this? So my call, and what we'll talk about next, is this idea of what I call, and what I've started to see a little bit in the research, is transformative hope. So the way that that essay I mentioned by Jensen talks about hope it really is a problem. Hope that is based in denial of the truth is counterproductive. It also does not lead to engagement. That whole like denial based, everything's going to be fine. But there's other ways to think about hope that have really been expanded in research literature, but also just in general, more popular in essays and poems and writings for the public as well. So there's two ways to think about hope that are common. One of them is called constructive hope. This is an approach that practices positive reappraisement. So we're looking for the good and the opportunities in a situation, really focuses on self-efficacy. And it acknowledges both the reality of the situation and the power we have to change it. So constructive hope has been found to be a very powerful predictor of climate action. And another term that I have seen a little bit more recently is called critical hope. And it's similar to this idea of constructive hope in that it's solution and action focused, but it's also focused deeply on healing of the underlying systems that cause the problems. So it's not just believing that we can find solutions to a specific problem, but it's understanding the systemic factors that led to that problem in the first place, the factors that confound the problem and that need to be addressed as part of the solution. So constructive hope is this sort of solution focused type of hope, and critical hope is a very systems focused type of hope. But I've started to see this term called transformative hope, which is based on education, transformative learning theory, which looks at these deep structural shifts in thoughts and behavior. And it's really focused on skills needed for addressing crises. So I'm talking about a type of teaching, a type of way of looking at the world that combines the solution and the system focused idea of hope. So it's a hope that is deeply informed about the truth of our situation, that understands the complexity of what's included in it, but that also believes in our ability, both individually and as a community, to make the changes needed to improve the system and its individual problems. So it's a very nuanced and complex perspective of hope that is very grounded in focusing on action. So what does this look like? I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I have some slides later that dive into detail on these different examples, but I probably won't spend a lot of time on them today just because of the time that we have available, but I'm happy to talk more about the topic with anybody who's interested. So a lot of this research in this transformative space right now is in the education realm and revolves around students, but I want to talk a little bit about how this applies to all of us as educators or as members of the community, but also to mention that any of us who are here are probably here because we're interested in communicating about climate change. And if you're communicating about climate change, then I think you're an educator. So all the education stuff applies to you too. So there's four big practices we can adopt when we're talking about transformative hope. One of them is the idea that transformative hope empowers people with practical skills and knowledge. The second is that it encourages critical thinking about socio-political factors that contribute to climate change, not just the science part, which is important, but also all the other pieces that connect to it. It fosters resilience and emotional coping strategies to handle anxiety, which is one of the things that we're doing here today. And then it promotes systemic change by really looking at those underlying injustices and advocating for equitable solutions. So again, we're not just trying to use technology to solve one specific climate problem, but we're saying, where did this all come from in the first place? And how can we fix that? And that's something that I think, MyCan and organizations like that do a really good job of trying to get deep into that systemic issue. The concept of transformative hope is related to some theories and recommendations from social science that you might have heard about before, and there's some specific tools we can use there. So this idea of appreciative inquiry and asset framing. These are two ideas that go hand in hand with transformative hope, are tools that we can use. I will share a PDF of these slides with Serena later if you want to go and look at these links. But asset framing in particular, there's a really wonderful podcast from a few years ago, an interview with Trabian Shorters, who started as one of the original folks who talked about asset framing and really thinking of this idea of how do we take what's good and how do we describe everybody and every community with dignity as we search for solutions to the problems. So we can dive a little bit more into that later. I'm not going to go too deep into these slides. I just wanted to have that information out there for you. But knowing, like, as we're practicing hope, we're doing it in a very practical, skill-based, uh, grounded in reality uh, manner. So as we start thinking more directly about hope, I want to read another poem for you by an author named Rosemary Watola Traumer about hope, and give us a chance to respond to the things that we've learned about hope and think about how to sort of integrate that in with the rest of the stuff we've talked about today. So I'll read this one along to you as well. Hope has holes in its pockets. It leaves little crumb trails so that we, when anxious, can follow it. Hope's secret. It doesn't know the destination. It knows only that all roads begin with one foot in front of the other. So once again, I'm going to play us. Maybe we'll do like 2.5 minutes this time so we can get through our last section before the end. What are you noticing going on inside yourself? What are you thinking about? What are you feeling? What are you reminded of as we reach this point in our discussion where we've gone through and we've looked at the fear and the reality, and we've dealt with kind of our anxiety about that and start to think about hope? How are we feeling now? So take a couple minutes, respond. Again, you can go back and start working on something you worked on before. You can add to it. You can do something new. I'll give you about 2.5 minutes to respond. Again, feel free to put your thoughts and feelings into the chat, and then I'll allow you to raise your hands after the time is up and share a little there as well. We'll have a chance to chat a little bit on the end. So thinking about everything that we've gone through, how we put that in practice, how do we teach, how do we learn, how do we live with transformative hope? I could dive really deep into all 4 of those components of what it looks like to live with transformative hope. I'm not gonna, because we've only got 15 minutes left. So I'm gonna do a quick flyover of those 4 elements that I talked about and share what for me is sort of the animating force beyond each of them. And then we'll end with a couple of gorgeous poems. One thing I want to say, one of the poems I didn't include in here that I've used in the past, which you may be familiar with, is Amanda Gorman's Earthrise. I don't know if you've heard that one. This is from, she wrote that, she's still quite young, but she was quite young when she wrote that one. And there's a beautiful, beautiful YouTube video of her reciting that poem. It's just like 5 or 6 minutes long. So I don't include it in my presentations always because I don't have time for it. But sometimes I've given that link out at the end and been like, I could just not give my presentation and give you this poem instead. So check that one out. It is really incredible, but it, I think, encapsulates that idea of the hope pieces that we're talking about. So, okay, last section here. What does it look like to live with transformative hope, to help others? So the first piece that many of us are very good at is empowering yourself and others with practical skills and knowledge. So this is a place that we often kind of stop when we're communicating about climate. We're like, okay, we got to understand the science and the systems, and we got to look at the consequences and the actions and the claims. This part is deeply, deeply important, but it often is kind of where we get stuck. We forget to do the other pieces, and the other pieces are important as well. So yes, keep working on understanding the science and the complexity and figuring out how to assess bias and what types of actions we might take. But as we're doing that, we want to also practice critical thinking about all of the factors that feed into this crisis. So this image up here, this is sort of a relic from when I do this presentation for educators, because this is a very education-focused theory, but it's called the Hope Wheel. It's a teaching practice in climate change education. I think it's really helpful for anybody who's thinking about communicating about climate change as well. And it's this idea that with the wheel, you don't want your lopsided wheel. You're not going to be able to move with that. And so there's all these different spokes of the wheel that we need to balance. So we need to balance individual and collective actions. We need to balance self-awareness and awareness of what's going on in the whole world. We've got to balance honesty about our situation, how bad things are, but also about what the solutions are. And we have to be willing to hold space for different experiences and perspectives in a way that is both safe and also brave. And so the wheel helps us sort of remember the idea of needing to balance that while also guarding against misinformation, false hope, and climate anxiety. And so this is like a way to help educators think about how to talk about climate change in a balanced way, and then also gives them this idea of now over top of this, we're going to balance, we're going to overlay these lenses of complexity, justice, different perspectives, creativity, empathy. I could probably do like a 2-hour presentation just on the hope wheel. So don't feel stressed out if you're kind of like, I don't know what you're talking about. But I wanted to throw this in here as an example of a way that we can think about these factors. So here's an example. If you're thinking about the honesty handrail, you're being truthful about the problems and the solutions. But if you're layering in all these other pieces, you're being truthful about the problems and the solutions that are out there in a way that empowers action at the individual and the collective level. And you're thinking about the considerations of justice and power as you do that. So I have some other examples of how this is actually applied. If you're an educator or you're interested in learning more, Iris mentioned Project Drawdown. Absolutely, they have incredible resources for this as well. So all this to say, we want to practice this critical thinking. We want to foster these resilience and emotional coping capabilities. And that's what this time together today is about, because that anxiety and that fear can be overwhelming. And so this practice of emotional resilience is so important. And again, one of those pieces that we don't always think about because we're so focused on the science and the solutions. So for me, not even just engaging and reading others or talking about poetry or creative writing as a way to process and express your feelings uh, is a wonderful way to help foster that resilience. But there might be other ways that work better for you. You know, spending time out in nature and connecting with that resource, engaging in these practices of climate justice, or even just doing so in community with other people are all ways that we can help foster that resilience and that emotional coping as we are working in this very difficult space. Some of you may or may not be familiar with the Climate Mental Health Network. Really wonderful, beautiful resources there for individuals, educators, parents, students. Highly encourage you check them out if climate anxiety or emotions are something that you're really grappling with in your day-to-day life. And then that fourth recommendation there is grounding climate action in systemic change. And so I want to highlight this one because sometimes we get excited about a specific action, but we don't always think about like, where does this fit in the big picture of change? So I'm going to give you just a really fast example of what this looks like with some of the educational projects we do. So I work with a lot of teachers who like, you know, to do things with trees, and they say, we're going to do a project with students that really engages their head and their heart and their bodies around climate change. And so they might start with connecting with nature, spending time with trees, learning about how trees benefit people, but then pulling in that system focus and thinking, where do we see places that don't have trees, that need more trees, and why aren't trees there? And what is the long-term environmental impact of planting those trees, and what that might have on the climate crisis? And then bringing students together to put trees in the ground. So students have engaged all those different pieces of their heart and their mind and their body in a way that exposes them to the systems and the issues that are at play, but also gives them the opportunity to act and address that issue. So that's an example on the education side, again, because that's where I live. You yourself might be engaging in activities this way as well. And ultimately, what I want to come down to is that this is all based in something internal for us. It needs to be based in something internal in order for us to be able to sustain our actions. And so when it comes to climate change education in particular, it can be easy to overwhelm young people and ourselves with all of this information and forget about the why. So that truly transformative hope needs to be based on this internal motivation of love. And that needs to be nurtured at all ages. And as I mentioned with young people, sometimes we ask them to strive for something that they have a hard time visualizing because they've never experienced it. So when in environmental education, there's this phenomenon called the shifting baseline theory, which argues that our planet has experienced so much degradation that a lot of young people actually don't know what a healthy, functioning ecosystem looks like, and that their frame of reference is based on something that's already degraded. And so as a result, the argument is that we should be giving our young people, and I find this in adults too, we should give people the opportunity to engage with and truly appreciate a healthy, beautiful environment so that our standards and our understanding of what it is we're fighting for are accurate. So David Sobel, really excellent writer on place-based environmental education, um, arguing that we need to let people, not just kids, wallow in and love the earth before we ask them to save it. We need to include that deep connection to our places and our environment in our outreach and our engagement and our understanding so that we have that inner motivation and understanding of the impact that can drive and pull us forward. I see a mention in the chat of organizations like Friends at Grand Rapids Parks, Plaster Creek Stewards in the Grand Rapids area. Yes, and they all do an incredible job of motivating that as well. So the last poem that I'm going to read aloud to you is one that a friend of mine shared with me by an author named Carrie Newcomer in Indiana. And it is called What Do I Love? Start from There. Um, I'm going to actually not give us our like 2 minutes right after that because there's one last thing I want to share with you. So I'm going to read this poem. I'm going to have you I want you to think about it while I'm reading it. And I'll get us right to my last little slide there, and then we can discuss. So this is called What Do I Love? Start from There by Carrie Newcomer. Perhaps the place to start is not to ask, what can I do? But first ask, what do I love? Begin from there, where the heart expands, where you know for sure what actually matters. Because it is love, always love, that keeps pointing us in the right general direction, illuminating the path, even if it cannot always clear the way. So as I flip through my last couple of slides to get us to our end, take a moment. Yeah, think about what is it that you love? What is it that points you in the right direction, that animates your climate action work? How does that work for you? How can you share that with others? Another beautiful youth activist voice here for you from Greta Thunberg talking about hope. It's love, but it's also not passive. It's not blah, blah, blah. It's telling the truth and taking action based on the things that we love. And if you have trouble figuring that out, there are ways to do this. Many of you are probably familiar with uh, the author Ayana Elizabeth Johnson and some of these incredible works that she has authored and edited around climate action and how to bring that. But one of the things that I think is beautiful is, her focus in on what is it that brings you joy and love and delight, and connecting that with what needs to be done and what your work is in order to find your climate action. And so I dropped in these places where I think the elements of transformative hope align with that perspective. And I'll include those references for you in maybe a follow-up email that has these slides. And I will mention, I mentioned to you earlier that I feel like the author of this essay comes back around to the same idea as I have about hope towards the end of his essay, where he says, why do I want to accomplish something in the real world? Because I'm in love with salmon, with the trees outside my window, etc. And if you love, you act to defend your beloved. If my love doesn't cause me to protect those I love, it's not love. And I think about some of the things that you've already all spoken about today. George talking about the river, people talking about their communities. That love is what animates us, and I think what all gives us sort of that rejuvenation and the hope internally that can give us the power to move on, even when things get difficult. And so I'm going to I'm going to play for you one last poem. So you get two for the price of one in this last sort of response period. And this is a poem that was written by a young Pakistani climate justice advocate in New York. It is read aloud by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson on, again, the On Being podcast with Krista Tippett. And I often close presentations with this poem because I get asked to speak on a lot of climate panels. And I always love saying, sometimes I just wish I could give you a love poem. And it's called On Another Panel About Climate. They asked me to sell the future, and all I've got is a love poem. So I'm going to play this one for you. It's just an audio. And then I'll open it up again for responses and conversation. We are getting close to the end of our time. So if you have to jump off, totally understandable. But this is our last little thing here. I don't have any more slides after this, so it's just conversation. I love that poem so much. Yeah. Um, I think that's a beautiful place to end, this idea that love is still the only revenge. It grows each time the earth is set on fire. We have this feeling sometimes that our climate activism is born of fear and rage. And in some places, yes, that animates us, but ultimately, the animation that will keep us going, that will allow us to have enough energy and work together, is that force of love. And we've got to figure out how to find that. I'd follow love into extinction. Yes, Iris, that's my, oof, it gives me shivers every time I read it. Um, I'll leave you with one last thing. This isn't really a poem, but it's like a phrase I've been thinking about a lot. There's an artist I really like who I buy stuff from her site all the time, but she made this really beautiful print recently that has all these cute little forest animals on it. And there was a phrase on there about the phrase is just, your heart is big enough for all of it. And that's all it says on it. And it has all these different creatures and things on it. But I think about that phrase a lot. Maybe someday some kind of writing will come out of me that includes that phrase, but it feels relevant to me when it comes to this work, this idea that like there is so much out there, and it's difficult, but our hearts are big enough for all of it. And I hope that we can share what's in our hearts with one another when it comes to the climate summit and beyond, because we're all together in the work here. So thank you for your time today. Appreciate you hanging out with me on a Sunday morning. Appreciate all of you so much. My contact info will be in there too if you want to reach out.